Hi all. Right, I'm decided that one of the things that we're missing out of by not having lessons in college at the moment is the stuff we do, which are a bit aside, where we talk about what's going on in the world and how that impacts on the politics that we're studying or going to study or have studied already. So I'm going to start doing this little series, an aside with Alan, where I talk about some of the current events in the news and how this can relate to the politics that we are studying. So today I'm going to talk about the state, and we shall see how it goes. Right, so we are in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, and this has brought about some quite remarkable shifts in the degree of state intervention that we see. The last time that anything of this kind of scale or size happened was during World War II. And that saw massive economic intervention by the government taking control of huge amounts, and also really strong restrictions on civil liberties. So what parallels can we draw? And we're going to have a look at that and see, again, what are the ideological impacts of this? And are the changes that we're going to see have a longer term effect? So the state during World War II took on a huge economic role. It restricted, or in sometimes increased, the amount of food people got through rationing. There was a huge change in the economy with a function on the movement towards war production. So they changed what companies were making, and so insisted that they made stuff for the war. They took control of certain industries, essentially nationalized them as part of the war effort. They placed higher taxes on luxury goods and on high incomes as they needed the money. Despite those higher taxes, the government debt rose to about £3 billion, which doesn't sound like a lot of money now, but was a lot of money back then. And one of the other things that kept the British economy going was that they received considerable aid from the US, largely through the Lend-Lease scheme. And so this kind of kept the British economy going, but we saw a level of state intervention in the economy that had never been seen before. And this started to alter the minds of some people. In terms of civil liberties, there were restrictions on what people could do, where they could go. So, for example, we saw blackouts, which were strictly enforced. There were curfews, and there were paroles by air raid wardens and the police to make sure people were staying down. Again, obviously, the big risk was if there was any light, that would potentially give a target for bombers. Children were evacuated from the cities. So children in cities such as London were moved out to live in the countryside. Some of you may have studied Goodnight, Mr. Tom when you were in English lower down school. There was conscription. Now, obviously, the most obvious of these is conscription into the armed forces, but there were also conscription into war production. And this included the Bevin boys, who were essentially drafted by a kind of lottery. And if your numbers came up, essentially that was you going and doing necessary work, for example, being sent down the mines. So again, we saw the state intervening and telling people what to do in a way that it hadn't done before. We also saw huge censorship in the media. So what could or couldn't be published was restricted. And we saw campaigns such as Careless Talk Costs Lives. And again, the aim of this was to try and get the country aboard, everyone pulling in the same direction, and making sure that the government had control of the narrative about what was going on. So we then look at the longer term impacts of this. During the war, there was a report produced known as the Beveridge Report. This was produced by Lord Beveridge, a Liberal Lord, and it led to what is known as the post-war consensus. And this was a period in British history where essentially these kind of principles were upheld by both major parties. And there was an agreement, consensus amongst those parties that these things needed dealing with. Now, Beveridge wrote about the 5 great evils, and the state was to play a massive role in addressing these great evils. So the great evils, to start off with, there was want. Essentially, this is poverty. And this led to the welfare state, and as early as during the war, we see the setting up of child allowance, something which you should all well be familiar with in modern day. So we start to see this idea that the poor in the country should be looked after by the government. Now, there had been liberal social reforms going back about 30, 40 years before this, but we were starting to see a welfare state on a different scale. Squalor was seen as a terrible blight on Britain. There was lots of really poor slum housing. A lot of this was knocked down. There were high quality council houses built after the war. And again, we started to see a kind of a standard of living, or an attempt to get a standard of living to the poorest end of society that hadn't seen before. And I may have spoken to you before about the kind of some of the more amusing stories of this coming, where you suddenly had these council houses built with internal bathrooms. People hadn't had these before, and there were some notable events, for example, in Yorkshire, where people went around the house and found the bathtub had been filled with coal. So there were these big changes. Disease was a big problem. Poor health was a major kind of restraint on the British Army, in fact, during World War II. And this led to the NHS, something which we are massively reliant on today, and all the phenomenal work that it does. Another one of the five giants was ignorance. Again, there was huge disparity in terms of the amount of education people received. And a lot of people were leaving school essentially at the end of primary school. The initial changes on this led to the rising of the school leaving age, which rose to 14, then on to 15, then to 16, and now today at 18. Initially, we saw secondary modern and grammar schools, and then eventually the post-war consensus moved, and we saw the advent of the grammar school. Sorry, so the end of the grammar, secondary modern in most places in the country, and the advent of the comprehensive school. Right, the final of the five giants, and seen by Beveridge as the most significant, was idleness. And this essentially is unemployment. And here the role of the state changed quite dramatically, with it becoming kind of essentially the key government policy to bring about full employment. Essentially, everybody who wanted a job would have a job. And this was done through central issues such as nationalisation of industry, but also in terms of the way the government would stimulate the economy. So the World War II changed the way that the state interacted with people in terms of the economy and civil liberties. And a lot of this actually then continued for a substantial period after the war. The post-war consensus continues all the way through to 1979. Right. So let's look at what's going on at the moment with COVID-19. So in terms of the economic impact, we're seeing government shutting businesses such as pubs and restaurants, initially trying to do this very softly, suggesting people didn't go to them, and then coming out a bit more harshly and saying, no, you can't open. The government has also pledged to pay up to 80% of people's wages in the areas of the economy that are badly affected by the virus, and this is part of a package said to be worth about £350 billion that the government is applying into the economy to try and keep things going and to try and protect businesses and individuals that are badly affected by the current crisis. The Bank of England has cut interest rates to a record low at 0.1%. And obviously, as I'm doing this to you online, the other thing that's happened is that schools have shut. And so we now see all schools and colleges shut, apart from for the children of key workers and the most vulnerable children in society. So we're seeing these massive changes. And people are being told wherever possible to work from home. There seems to be some confusion day by day who exactly that includes. And we continually see stuff on the news about crowded tube stations and things like that. So again, I'm sure as I speak, as always the way with politics, this will go out of date very quickly. We're not yet quite in full lockdown, but that might well be coming. In terms of civil liberties, again, not all of this has full legal enforcement yet, but it does seem to be coming. Essentially, we're being told to carry out no unnecessary travel, not to meet up with people from outside your household, Exercising, going out for a walk has been restricted to once per day. There are travel bans. There is, as we've already said, the shutting of businesses, the closing of some public spaces, such as libraries and playgrounds, all in the aim to bring about social distancing. So things that people take for granted, things that they think they should just be able to do, the government is slowly, or in some extent quite rapidly, bringing in changes to restrict that. Now, what we will see is how long that lasts, what compliance is like, and eventually how things happen as the government will scale this back as the crisis passes. So will all this lead to long-term changes? So World War II led to shifts in attitude on what the state could do and should do. Will COVID-19 do the same? Will it change people's attitude to how much the state should intervene to help the poor in society? Will it change people's attitude to pay in the public services, most particularly within the NHS, when the country is seen to be so reliant on these, and also on other areas of the economy, which we might see kind of seen as have been underappreciated, such as the social care sector, those working in areas such as delivery and in supermarkets. And if attitudes change, might they change in other ways about the state? I mean, other things might kick in terms of ideas of civil liberties. And again, it might show how these can be restricted by government. And although people might well respect this and accept this in terms of the crisis, might there need to be some more stringent things put in place in terms of the Constitution to protect these? So will we change our attitudes towards the state? Will we change our attitudes towards work? All these things are to be seen. Right, I'm going to go hopefully fairly quickly now through some ideological perspectives about the state. And again, this is things we'll be doing in the ideology unit coming up. And we see what we would see if you applied those ideologies, strictly speaking, in this crisis. Would it work? In fact, can you apply political ideology when dealing with a major crisis? So let's have a look at how the different ideologies think of the state. Right, so socialists. Socialism believes in a strong state that promotes equality. They believe in common ownership, in state control of industry. They believe in redistribution of wealth, extensive public state services, and extensive state regulation of business and the economy. Again, you might see some aspects here in terms of what government has done. Now, is this just a matter of crisis management, or is there some socialist ideology creeping in to Boris Johnson's government? Now, liberalism. Liberalism believes in upholding the rights of the individual through a limited government, so it doesn't believe in strong government intervention. So government should always be by consent. But again, even in crisis management, you could see that what we are witnessing is government by consent. The government is bringing in stricter and stricter regulations, but often there has been a public clamour for those before they have come in. And in some ways, the government can be seen to be a step behind some aspects of society. Some businesses are closing before being told to. Some schools were partially shut down before being told to. So again, is this government by consent? Now, ideology based around individualism and capitalism, again, might not quite fit with the crisis as it stands. But we also are seeing maybe some aspects of liberal ideology in terms of tolerance and in terms of accepting other people. But again, we might also see some issues with that. We are probably not seeing limited government. Now, would it be viable for a liberal government to have stuck to all these bases of their beliefs about the state in this crisis? Could you have just said, we would rather you wouldn't, rather than you can't? So again, would a truly liberal government manage to deal with this crisis? Right, so this one should be the most straightforward. Conservative ideology. Right, now conservative ideology is centered around order and authority. again, things which would prove to fit quite nicely with the current crisis. They believe in a hierarchy and a ruling class traditionally. Again, conservatism is quite a complicated ideology with lots of different strands. Traditional conservatism is built on that basis. As conservatism developed, there's more of an idea of the nation state, an idea of kind of a British identity, the conventions, traditions, including the monarchy, and these are the things that a conservative state would look to uphold and maintain. Again, as conservatism further developed, we saw Thatcherism and the New Right, and they looked to cut back and streamline the state. Again, this would not seem to necessarily fit with what we're seeing happening at the moment as state intervention grows. Now, traditional conservatism always did accept a degree of state intervention in the economy, so that would maybe not be completely out of line with what is going. The bit of ideology that would be that New Right Thatcher ideology that would strongly oppose the idea of government handouts, government interventions, government getting involved in business and industry. So there are different aspects of conservative ideology, and one of the things we've spoken about in class before is, well, what kind of conservative is Boris Johnson? And actually, does this current crisis give us a little bit more insight into this? Or again, are we looking at crisis management and pragmatism and not ideology? Right. So things to think about, and hopefully you can leave some comments and some discussion pieces underneath this on YouTube. Right. Is the government following any of these three ideologies? If so, which bits of which ones? Is it following just one of them? And will the public attitude be affected and moved maybe towards one of these ideologies because what is happening? So we've got a kind of a really interesting part in terms of the belief of the state in what is a really kind of bleak and difficult time. But again, these are things for you to be thinking about as we get ready for the ideology unit. And again, just to be thinking about and questioning what is going on around you. So I will see you all again soon.